Hello everyone, welcome to Sabbath School Gems, where each week we showcase key concepts from this week's Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath School lesson. Hello everyone, we are on lesson 2 for 2022 for the second quarter, and it's titled The Fall, and it's from the lesson quarterly Genesis. And this is the lesson about the fall. It's mostly in Genesis 3. And, when I was younger, I would always read this section about the fall. If I wanted to be sad, and you say, well, why would you want to be sad? But on the Day of Atonement, we're supposed to have our souls afflicted. And I would go to this passage and I would be reading about how there was this perfect paradise and then how it just fell and then became ridden with sin and death and all these sad things about pain and childbirth and having to labor for your food. And it was just so sad. And then the isolation from God and his disappointment. And so I would always read the story. But this has got so much more in it. And it's actually not a sad story in some sense, because it's really an encouraging story about God's desire to teach us the essentials of our existence and the universe. And why would he want to do that? So we can be saved from sin and we can be saved from evil. So it actually has a lot of lessons. I don't think we're going to get to all the lessons. Sometimes I want to write a book that's titled Lessons from the Garden of Eden, because there's so much in here. We're not going to even get to them all in this time that we have, but I want to get through some key ones. The Sabbath School Quarterly says that God wanted us to know good and he didn't want us to know evil. And that's interesting. I didn't think of that before. But that's interesting to think of it in that perspective. He said, of every tree you may freely eat, but of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. So I always thought that he intended for us to eat of that tree of knowledge of good and evil eventually. But, to some degree, I think that's the lesson quarterly has a good point. He didn't really want us to know sin. Why did he want us to be acquainted with evil? Why would he want us to even observe it or see the effects of it? So I think there is some truth in that he wanted us to see good and just to know good and to live with good intentions. Why should we be burdened with this burden of sin and all that? But unfortunately, evil doesn't work like that. And we can see right away in the Bible that evil can come in even if you don't know about it. And we can sin even though we don't know we're sinning. In Ezekiel 28:14, it says, you were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in all your ways from the day you were created till iniquity was found in you. So how did Satan fall? Iniquity was found in it. Where did it come from? And how did it just get in him? So this is something that's important for us to realize, that evil is out there. And even if we don't know about it, we can still align with it. And that is one of the most important points, because if we can just sin, even in ignorance, and I'll just read from Ezekiel 45:20. It says, and so you shall do on the 7th day of the month for everyone who has sinned unintentionally or in ignorance. Thus you shall make atonement for the temple. And that's just one example, but all through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, it talks about if a person sins unintentionally, they shall bring the sin offering. If they don't know, if they do it unwillingly, or they don't know, and then when they find out, oh, I sinned, oh, I did something wrong, then they were to bring their offering. So that shows that we can sin even if we don't know we're sinning. And some people say, well, but Eve knew she was disobeying, and Adam knew he was disobeying God. Yeah, they did. They did know that. But they didn't know the whole consequences of it. They didn't really see the effects of death. So when God says, don't eat of this because you're going to die, they don't have that extra motivation because they don't even know what death really looks like. So in some sense, they were really ignorant and they didn't know good from evil. And so they sinned, though they could disobey God even without the knowledge of good and evil. So that is, I think, a very key point. Now, Sunday's lesson talks about the servant, And that's such a fitting description for Satan for so many different reasons, and for those who align with evil. I mean, here's this small and unassuming creature, and I know Ellen White says it was a dazzling creature, and maybe it was. I'm not disputing that, but now we know snakes and serpents to be these small, unassuming. You hardly even see them, and if you do, it's only for a brief moment as they, slither off to get away from you. They're very elusive, and they're small, but they can do a lot of damage. They can be very deadly. In fact, probably the deadliest snake bites are the ones from the baby rattlesnakes. So here you have these little tiny rattlesnakes, and it's not because their venom is more deadly than the adult. It's because when they bite, they don't know how to just release a little bit. So they just release everything. And so you get a big dose of venom. So these little tiny baby rattlesnakes can kill. They can make a person really sick, or they can kill you. Snakes are deadly. And then there's a lot of different types of snakes. And there's a lot of snakes that aren't deadly, but there's some of the most deadly animals are snakes. So they can kill humans. And they usually kill them inadvertently. Another thing, they are kind of elusive. And so chances are when you get bit by a rattlesnake, it's because you accidentally fell on it, or you were riding your mountain bike and you ran over it or something. And that's usually how the snake bites occur, when somebody just falls on it or accidentally, or you reach in between rocks or something. It's not that you see it coming. So that's another thing that it's very fitting, because evil just and temptations just kind of creep in when we're not looking. And there's the mixing of truth and error. When it says in Genesis 3, 4, and 5, that then the serpent said to the woman, "You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Well, then we see later that her eyes were opened, and they did see good and evil. So there's some truth into that. It was also, "You will not surely die." Well, they didn't die immediately. It wasn't like it's a poison and they got a stomach ache and died right away. So there's always some truth, and then the error is just mixed in with it. And usually, I think sometimes maybe even more truth than error, but it's that error that's the deadly mixture that just gets mixed in there. No, you won't surely die. No, this is good for food. Look at how pleasant this is. And that's exactly how Satan works. That's exactly his method of operation, and that's how sin comes in, because it can just be found in someone if they make that choice. But there's also this deception aspect, and that's what we're really dealing with. It does have to do with deceit. And then, of course, the snake, I'll just kind of skip ahead because it talks about the serpent later, but I think we can get it over with here, is just the punishment and the fate of this. What is the fate of the serpent? Well, the serpent ends up not elevated in a tree, but slithering on the ground. No arms, no legs, no wings. I mean, you think, how does it even get around? It's so vulnerable. It's like this big worm, and it's easily killed by humans. And that is the fate if we do not trust God. And of course, there's always that terminology of bit the dust. The serpent is supposed to eat dust. Well, if you don't live on dirt, you can't survive on dirt. So the ultimate fate of the serpent is death. And that is the ultimate fate of those who do not trust and obey God. So now Monday is lessons on the forbidden fruit. This one I think is important to point out how Satan attacks us at our most vulnerable, and he uses the good and healthy things that God gave us. It's this deception thing where you're mixing in bad with good, or truth, error and truth. It's the same thing. Satan will use the most beautiful things, the gifts that God gave us. So it says in Genesis 3:5, "For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Well, let's just pick this apart. God gave us a desire to increase in wisdom. From the time we're babies to the time we die, our minds are hopefully continually growing, and we're getting knowledge and we're learning things. And he wants us to have that wisdom, and he put that desire into us. Otherwise, we would just We wouldn't be motivated to learn new things. So that's a good thing that God put into us. He also likes us to desire beautiful things. Eve saw that it was pleasant to the eyes. Whatever that fruit was, it was pleasant to the eyes. He gave us that desire to look at things and to see, oh, this is good, this is beautiful. And then he gave us a desire for food and for pleasure and sustenance. It says when the woman saw that the tree was good for food. That's a necessary and vital aspect of our existence. If we don't eat, we will not live. So we have an innate built-in desire for food and for sustenance. And he gave us a desire for our spouses, the bond, which is supposed to be one of the strongest on earth. You know, when it says she gave to her husband with her and he ate. Well, of course he ate. He wanted to be not to be separated from her. And that is a normal desire, and that is a noble desire. And so these are all really good things. And then there's a desire not to die. Satan, that's where he slipped that lie in there. You will not surely die. You know, that's a built-in desire of us. We were never meant to die, so why would we want to die? And food is actually the opposite of death because it's giving us life. And then there's the other aspect, desire to be like God. Oh, for God knows in the day you eat it, you will be like God. So Satan is enticing us with something that's a normal desire, our desire to be like God. That is a good thing. We should desire to be like God, not to just have his power or have his knowledge, but we should be striving to be like him, to be close to him, and to like what he likes and do what is good. So these are all things, the desire for wisdom, to look at beautiful things, to get food and sustenance, to want to be with our spouses and not lose them, and to be on the same page as they are, and to desire for life and to be like God. These are all good things. So see, Satan is attacking us using good, normal desires. And we can look in our own lives and see, okay, where are our weaknesses? Because they're going to be starting out with something that's good. You know, if we have a problem with food, or we have a problem with whatever addictions or something, it's because we're getting something good out of it. And so we can use that, and we can hopefully get a handle on some of our desires that maybe get out of control, because it all starts with something good. The problem isn't the good. The problem is the disobedience of God and not trusting him even when we don't know. Now, I have said this before on Gems, and a lot of people will disagree with me, or they don't understand maybe what I mean by this, but I think God probably intended for them to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil at some point in time. I mean, he put it right in the middle of the garden. He put it right next to the tree of life. And it also allows us to communicate with God on a deeper level. You know, we're not like the animals. The animals don't understand good and evil. There's a lot of things in life that are explained, that we see, that are explained by that, having that knowledge of good and evil. And also by having knowledge of good and evil. When the person sins unintentionally, and then they realize that they sin, and then they can bring their offering. They can get forgiveness for that. And hopefully they'll not sin again. So by having that knowledge, we can avoid sin. I mean, you know, sin can come in even if we don't see it. But what if we do see it and we make that choice? What if Satan's not there trying to deceive bad in with good, so that we don't work, our senses are clouded and we don't really know what we're choosing? What if we can see it out in the open? We can see light and darkness, good and evil, death and life, and then we can make a really clear decision. So I think that knowledge is important. It could be used for something good. And remember, it's not the knowledge of the good and evil that causes death. They ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That's not why they died. The death comes from God taking them away from the tree of life. So it was an act of God and that isolation that exists that ends in death, not necessarily the knowledge of good and evil. So I think that he put the tree there for them eventually. That was his intent, for us to understand good and evil. And that's what I think he's trying to teach us with all this. You have to think either he put the tree just to tempt them, even though he probably knew that at some point in time, throughout, people say that Eve sinned and, she just doomed us all. Well, just think about it. I mean, she just had a son, and that son was a murderer. So how many generations would it be before somebody took of that fruit? And not only that, but when we're complicit in sin, we're taking of that fruit, basically. So sin would start at us. So there's a general trend to say, because of what Eve did, now we're all weakened individuals and we're just all weak. And no, God made us strong, perfect, and beautiful. And even though we do have genetic defects and we do have weaknesses from living in this planet of sin, I acknowledge that. But I still think spiritually, God has us perfect in the sense of He wants us to be like Him. And He wants to make us like Him someday in all the completeness. And He wants to start that process right now, right this very second or yesterday. He wants to start that process in us. So I believe that we're not marred to this point where we can't resist sin. He's giving us all the ability and the tools and everything necessary. Why would He be going through all this if, it's just not possible for us? We're just living this life of sin and we're just doomed. So I really don't ascribe to that idea that, what Eve did, now we're all doomed. Because like I said, every day we're making choices, and we're making choices with eyes a lot more open than Eve was. We see the consequences. She didn't see it. She didn't really understand what death was. She made a one-time error, and we make daily choices. So, I think what we should be doing is looking more about the lesson of all this, that we need to learn to trust God and obey Him and commune with Him, even with things that we don't know. Eve didn't know. There's going to be things that we don't quite understand. Will God want us to understand Him? Probably someday. But if we don't understand Him, it's not a reason to not trust God. So we really need to trust God. So I don't think He put the tree there to tempt them, but to teach them. And somebody said, well, maybe it's to tempt and to teach. But I don't really think it was there to tempt them. I think it was all there to teach us, all of us, that we need to trust Him, even with things that we don't see. Otherwise, we won't have access to the tree of life. We're in what Malcolm Randall called the death solutions. When we don't trust God and He's not able to protect us, or He's not willing, or whatever, we lose that connection with Him. We're on our own because He created us. We will die on our own. We need that access to the tree of life, and He is the one that has that. For us, we're humans, we're created beings. We don't have any other access aside from Him. So we should be doing everything we can to connect with Him and to trust Him. And through the temptation of things that are desirable, as I mentioned, all those wonderful things, is the redemption through things that are painful, if you want to call them painful. But, the humility, Eve's consequences, desire for her husband, he shall rule over you. But by embracing our position in life and reverencing and elevating God to His level much higher than us, that's where this redemption comes. And then Eve's also was going to have pain in childbirth. But then she was going to have redemption through bearing children. Why? Because childbirth and rearing children is learning to put others first. So there again, that's where the lesson comes in, and that's where our hope is. So you take something that seems like it's painful or difficult, but we learn to put others first. I mean, a lot of parents will give their life so that their child could have life. They would rather have the cancer instead of their child, so that their child can have a chance of life that's learning how to put others first. And then what about Adam in Genesis 3:19? In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. In that, we have the hope that through this work, through this passage that we have on this planet of evil, that we can conquer evil, that we, just like in the garden, we can plant, we can conquer the weeds, we can conquer the serpents. We will have dominion. He tells Cain, you shall bruise his heel. We will have, and we can have, victory over evil. And so that is the good news about that. Now, Tuesday's lesson is hiding before God. And this is where we really start to see the great controversy and what happens with the effects of sin and why we need salvation. Sin isolates us from God, and that's whether it's intentional sin or not. So they had to bring their offerings, when they touched something that was unclean, let's say, or they ate something, they were unclean and they defiled something that was clean by, let's say, a priest ate the offering, but they weren't fully clean, but then they realized later they were clean. These are things that you become, in the Bible, the word is in Hebrew, it's hasham. You're like defiled. But you might not know you're defiled, but you still are. So in other words, even unintentional sin isolates us from God. God can't exist with evil, or people don't like to say he can't. Maybe he can, but maybe he doesn't want to. I mean, he separated out light from darkness at his very first act. So he wants us, and he created us as creatures for light. We are creatures of the day. He wants us to be that, and that's what he desires for us. So we read in Genesis 3:8, and they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and Eve hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. You'll see, they are the ones that realize their sin. They realize their disobedience, and it separated them from God. Now, did the Lord separate at that point? No. He came to meet with them. And in fact, in Genesis 3:9, it says, then the Lord God called to Adam and said to him, where are you? See, he still wants Adam and Eve. He wants to talk with them. He wants to walk with them. He wants to meet with them. Unfortunately, it wasn't later until when Seth was born. We read this in Genesis 4:26. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. So we see that it took several generations, and then men started to call, and even then it was only a few, right? But we look at Elijah. At 1 Kings 18:24, it says, then you call on the name of your gods. This is when he's telling all the people before Baal. He's like, you call on the name of your gods, and I'll call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And so all the people said, yeah, let's do this. And, that whole incident where he put the sacrifice and put all the water, and then they cried out to all their gods, and nothing ever happened. And then finally he calls to the Lord, and he comes down and just burns up the sacrifice and licks up all the water and everything, because he is a God. But you see, calling on the name of the Lord is something that we do, and it's very difficult to do it when we have sin. And that's why he started this whole plan of redemption, is so that we can come to him. In fact, the whole temple sacrifices and all that was so people could be clean, so they could have a clean conscience, so they could come to God. That's what he wants with us, and that's what sin does. It separates us from God. And just making a mention of the blame game, because that's what was going on with Eve was blaming the serpent, and Adam was blaming Eve. And the blaming doesn't help the problem, because ultimately what we need to do is make a decision. And we need to decide whether we're going to listen and trust and obey God. And we kind of have to use those English words, listen, trust, and obey. It's all in that word shema. Shema, kol. So kol is the voice of God. And we are the ones that need to shema. We need to listen and trust and obey. We need to make that decision and take full responsibility. So it's good that they also include that lesson about the blaming, because that doesn't help. That doesn't get us to where we need to be, which is making our own decision. And then Wednesday's lesson talks about the fate of the serpent. And that one we kind of went over already, but the ultimate fate of the serpent is our fate. If we disobey God, we don't have an existence with him. And then I just want to skip to Friday's lesson. The lesson study author makes a comment, moral and spiritual choices have an impact on biological life. And I think that's what we've just been talking about, how, our decision, that decision that we need to make, is going to impact whether we have life or not. And even if we don't know or we can't see clearly, we need to make that decision And only then can we have access or hope to have access to the tree of life. It wasn't the eating of the fruit necessarily. It wasn't that. It was a desire for a higher position maybe, or for things we're not ready for knowledge we're not ready for. So I think the biggest take home of all this, of this fall, is that we are in that same decision state that Eve was in, but we are in a better state than Adam and Eve because we can see clearly life and death, good and evil, and the consequences of it. So what our decision is the same as theirs. Are we going to trust God even with things that we can't see? Now, we can see way more than they could see. So hopefully our decision will be sure, and that we can see through all the wiles of Satan and all the deceptions because we can see more clearly now. But the ultimate is for us to make that decision of whether we are going to listen and obey and trust God. And it sounds really easy, but it's not really easy because there's even things in the Bible that a lot of people just dismiss. And they say, well, why should we do that? Why should we do that? Well, if God tells us to do it, and if he at all puts it into your knowledge and puts it in your heart, then you probably should do it. I think the biggest tragedy is not doing something that we think that we should be doing, or listening to other people, or the worst thing is when we tell other people against what their conscience is. If somebody feels compelled to do something and they feel like God is telling them to do that, and of course hopefully with lots of prayer and contemplation, but I think it's not our position, because we all need to be getting to that point where we're listening to God and we're following him and we're trusting him. Yes, even with things that we don't know, he wants to give us knowledge, but we need to be able to humble ourselves before him and just trust and obey. All right, till next time. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Sabbath School Gems. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word to others. Comments and questions can be sent to us at sabbathschoolgems@gmail.com. Bye for now.